In a world where power is measured by the volume of a telepathic scream, the Unspoken Alpha is a breathtaking journey into the beauty of absolute silence. This isn't just another werewolf romance. It is a high-stakes psychological thriller that explores what happens when the most powerful man in the world meets the only woman he cannot mentally colonize. Chapter 1. The Bone Grinder. Being a monster is a lonely business, but forgetting your own name is a special kind of hell. I huddled in the corner of my pitch-black cell, my claws scraping against the frost-bitten stone. My human skin felt like a suit of wet wool 2 sizes too small, while my wolf fought to rip through my ribs. It was a glitch, a half-transformation that left me looking like a nightmare and feeling like a car wreck. Truth be told, the physical pain was nothing compared to the silence in my head. Because I was locked in this skin, the pack's telepathic mind link was gone. I was a radio with no signal, just static and white noise. Next, the grinding started again. My bones shifted with a sickening pop, pop, crack, trying to decide if they belonged to a man or a beast. I snarled, the sound vibrating in my chest like an old engine. Silas, I whispered, the name tasting like copper and old memories. My name is Silas. I had to say it out loud because if I didn't, the wolf would swallow the man whole. After that, I felt the silver dampeners in the walls pulse, sending a wave of nausea through my gut. Caden, my own brother, and the man who stole my throne, had lined this hole with enough silver to kill a forest of shifters. From there, I closed my eyes and tried to remember what the sun felt like. Instead, I felt the heavy, thrumming weight of the obsidian keep above me. It was a fortress of mental slavery, where every mind was a slave to Caden's ego. Still, there was a strange rhythm to the dungeon tonight. At that moment, I froze. My ears, long and pointed, twitched toward the corridor. I heard a heartbeat. It wasn't the heavy, arrogant stomp of a guard, nor was it the frantic pitter-patter of a rat. It was steady. It was soft. More importantly, it was a heartbeat that carried no mental buzz. There was no signal coming from this person. Soon after, the air in the hallway changed. Shifters usually smell like earth, musk, and the Alpha's brand, but this scent was different. It smelled like mountain air after a rainstorm and a strange, haunting nothingness. It was a blank scent. Maybe it was fate, but my wolf stopped growling. She didn't know what scared her more, the silence or the beauty of that scent. I pressed my snout against the cold iron of my door. In the span of a breath, the footsteps stopped right outside. I could feel the heat of a body just inches away. Without warning, the lock clicked. The heavy door didn't open, but the small viewing slit did. My golden eyes, glowing like dying coals in the dark, locked onto a pair of startled, wide human eyes. Chapter 2. The Mountain Ghost. Caden's voice arrived before he did, an oily sound that made my skin crawl. Look at it, Elara. This is what happens to those who can't follow the rhythm of the pack. What followed was the sound of the viewing slit being slammed open with a metal clang. Caden was parading her. That night, he stood there in his expensive silk shirt, looking every bit the CEO king he pretended to be. Beside him was the source of the mountain air scent. She was small, with hair the color of moonlight and a face that looked like it was carved from pale marble. She didn't speak. Truth be told, she didn't even breathe as she stared into my cage. She's a mute, Silas. Caden laughed, his hand gripping the girl's shoulder tight enough to bruise. A shifter without a voice. No mind link, no utility. Just like you, she's a ghost in my machine. On the other hand, I wasn't looking at Caden. I was watching the way her eyes didn't fill with the usual terror. In fact, she looked at my matted fur and the bone shards sticking out of my shoulders with something that felt like pity. As if pulled by a string, I felt a surge of rage that wasn't for me. It was for her. Caden treated her like a trophy, a piece of broken glass he'd picked up from the Crescent Pack. Despite that, Caden leaned in closer to the bars, his eyes flashing a predatory red. I claimed her because her scent is pure, but I'm keeping her down here so I don't have to look at her defect. To make things worse, he reached out and flicked the girl's ear, mocking her silence. Before she could move, I let out a roar that shook the very foundations of the keep. I slammed my massive, deformed paws against the silver bars, the metal burning my flesh instantly. As the silence roared, Caden jumped back, a smirk dancing on his face despite the shock. He liked the fear I caused, which meant he was oblivious to the way the girl, Elara, stayed exactly where she was. Meanwhile, the silver began to smoke against my skin. The pain was a blinding white light, but I didn't stop. I wanted Caden away from her. As the wind shifted, I caught another whiff of her scent. It sharpened, turning from rain to ozone. Something inside her shifted, and I felt it in my own marrow. She wasn't just silent. She was a vacuum. She was a hole in the world where Caden's mental dominance simply died. As a result, Caden grew bored of his taunting. "Throw her in the next cell," he barked at the guards. "Let the ghosts haunt each other." Wait, what happens when two people who don't exist in the pack's mind finally find each other? Chapter 3. The Touch of Silence. Come morning, the dungeon felt colder than usual. I could hear Elara in the cell next to mine. She didn't pace. She just sat. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the sound of her soft breathing from me. I was resigned to my fate as a monster, but I couldn't stand the thought of her being alone in that damp hole. So, I decided to test the guards. Moments later, 3 of them walked down the hall, their minds buzzing with Caden's orders. They stopped at her door, their thoughts turning dark and cruel. They wanted to play with the mute girl. Without thinking, I hurled my body against the cell door. And just like that, everything changed. I roared, a sound that ripped through the stone and sent the guards stumbling back in terror. Because of that, the silver bars hummed, sending a lethal dose of electricity through my frame. I collapsed, my lungs seizing, but I kept my eyes on the corridor. The guards fled, their cowardice overriding their cruelty. Still, the price was high. I lay in the dark, my heart stuttering, my body smoking from the silver burns. I was a failure of a king and a failure of a beast. But then, I felt it. A small, delicate hand reached through the gap in the stone wall between our cells. As if fate demanded it, Elara had found a loose brick. She didn't say a word, but her fingers brushed against the matted fur of my shoulder. The moment their eyes locked through the cracks, the world tilted. As her wolf stirred, something exploded in my head. It wasn't the buzz of Caden's mind link. Rather, it was a flood of pure emotion. I felt her loneliness. I felt the crisp cold of her mountain home. At that moment, her soul answered my silent scream. Deep down, she knew the truth. And now I did too. We weren't broken. We were simply tuned to a different frequency. Before either could speak, not that we could, the sensory link solidified. Between one breath and the next, I saw her childhood through her eyes. I saw her being treated like a ghost because she couldn't shout in the minds of others. As the bond pulsed, my own glitch began to settle. For the first time in 10 years, my bones stopped grinding. As the silence stretched, I realized I wasn't a monster. I was a protector. And she let it happen, her hand staying firm against my burning skin, as if to say, I am here, and you are real. Chapter 4. The Hungry Dark. The sensory link didn't just open a door, it blew the hinges off my soul. Because of that, the agonizing grinding in my joints stopped as if a master key had finally turned in a rusted lock. I wasn't just a beast anymore. I was a man trapped in a beast's frame, and for the first time in a decade, I could think straight. As if fate demanded it, Elara didn't pull her hand away when my breathing turned into a ragged sob. She pressed her palm harder against my matted shoulder, her warmth soaking through the filth of my fur. In the span of a breath, I felt her terror. What followed was a sudden cold realization. Caden wasn't just keeping her here to hide her away, he was planning to use her, Still, I couldn't warn her with words. I could only push my feelings back through the link, showing her the jagged, dark memories of Caden's true nature. Maybe it was fate, but she didn't flinch at the blood in my past. Rather, she sent back a wave of calm that felt like standing in a field of lavender. Truth be told, I didn't deserve her peace, but I drank it like a dying man in a desert. Soon after, the heavy iron door at the end of the hall groaned open. Without thinking, I pulled away from the wall, my instincts screaming at me to hide our connection. I scrambled into the shadows just as Caden stepped into the dim light. In fact, he looked worse than he had the day before. His skin was pale, and his eyes had a frantic, sunken look. That night, the singularity ritual was taking its toll on him. He needed more power, and he needed it now. Before the words left her lips, though they never would, I saw Elara shrink back into the corner of her cell. To make things worse, Caden didn't go to her cell. He came to me. Under the weight of his stare, I felt the echo of his mind trying to pry its way into my skull. "You look different today, Silas," he murmured, his voice cracking like dry parchment. As the silence roared, he gripped the silver bars, seemingly unbothered by the way they scorched his palms. Because of that, I knew he was high on the stolen life force of the pack, which meant he was reaching his breaking point. He needed a vessel that wouldn't shatter under the pressure of 1,000 stolen souls. Chapter 5. The Pure Vessel. Moments later, Caden turned his predatory gaze toward Elara's cell. "The others are too loud, Silas," he whispered, almost to himself. "Their thoughts are like bees stinging my brain. But she is a beautiful, empty room." She didn't know what scared her more, the way he looked at her or the way the air seemed to thin when he spoke. As if pulled by a string, Caden signaled the guards to open her door. Without warning, they dragged her out. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't break their grip as they forced her toward my cell. "I'm going to put her in with you, brother." Caden smirked, a cruel light dancing in his eyes. "A little experiment. I want to see if your darkness can stain her silence." As a result, the guards threw her into my cage. And just like that, everything changed. The heavy iron door slammed shut, locking us in the dark together. In that moment, I stood over her, a 7-foot-tall nightmare of fur and bone. Her body moved on instinct, curling into a ball as she waited for the end. I could smell her fear. It was sharp, like iron and cold sweat. Deep down, she knew the truth, or thought she did. She expected me to rip her throat out because that's what Caden told her I was. Instead, I lowered my head and let out a soft, huffing sound. I moved with a grace my broken body shouldn't have possessed, circling her until I was between her and the bars. As if fate whispered, I realized Caden was watching us, waiting for a bloodbath. Even so, I wouldn't give him the satisfaction. In the quiet that followed, I felt Elara's hand reach out again, searching for me in the dark. Between them, something cracked. The moment her skin touched my snout, the sensory link surged with a violent intensity. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I saw what Caden really wanted. He didn't want a mate. He wanted a grounding wire. He wanted to pour all the pack's psychic agony into her because she had no voice to scream it back. What's worse, the ritual would leave her a hollow shell, her mind erased to make room for his garbage. Because of that, I let out a growl that wasn't a threat to her, but a promise of war to him. Chapter 6. The Shadow's Promise. As the sky darkened outside the high, narrow slits of the keep, Silas and Elara sat huddled together in the furthest corner of the cell. By the time Caden grew bored and left, the air in the dungeon had thickened with unspoken promises. As his scent in the air faded, I shifted my weight, careful not to crush her. Without another word, I used my claw to scratch a single symbol into the dirt of the floor, a circle with a line through it. The mark of the crescent pack, the mark of home. Her chest ached when she saw it, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Next, I focused on the shadows in the corner. As her wolf stirred, I showed her what I could do. I leaned back into the darkness, and just like that, I vanished. My body didn't just hide, it became part of the ink. Moments later, I reappeared a few feet away, my golden eyes the only thing visible. Time stood still as she watched me. I saw the gears turning in her head. She realized that we weren't just prisoners anymore. We were a weapon that Caden couldn't see and couldn't hear. More importantly, she realized I was teaching her how to do it too. Eventually, she mimicked my posture. She closed her eyes and focused on the silence that had always been her prison. As though fate whispered, she began to realize that her silence was actually her greatest strength. In the span of a breath, her outline began to blur. Truth be told, she was a natural. Because she didn't have the noise of a mind link, she could slip between the cracks of reality easier than I ever could. As the bond pulsed, I felt a surge of pride that nearly knocked me over. But then, a sharp pain shot through my mark. The silver in the walls groaned, reacting to the shift in energy. As the silence roared, I pulled her back to the physical world. We weren't ready to escape yet, but the foundation was laid. She felt it, clear as day. We were no longer two broken things waiting to die. Her soul answered the fire in my veins. As the wind shifted through the hallway, carrying the distant, tortured howls of our packmates, I knew our time was running out. And she let it happen, leaning her head against my chest, as we prepared for the fight that would either set us free or bury us both in the dark. Chapter 7. The Silent Lesson. Survival in the Obsidian Keep wasn't about strength, it was about rhythm. Because of that, I spent the next few days watching the guards through the iron slats with a predator's focus. What followed was a pattern only a ghost could see. The guards moved like clockwork, their minds so plugged into Caden's telepathic static that they walked in a trance. Next, I turned to Elara. She sat in the center of our cell, her eyes closed, her breathing shallow. As her wolf stirred, she was trying to reach for the shadows again. Truth be told, she was moving too fast. Without warning, I nudged her shoulder with my snout, breaking her focus. At that moment, I pushed a feeling of patience through the link. As the silence stretched, I showed her how to listen with her skin. I pressed my paw against the stone floor, sensing the vibrations of footsteps 3 floors above us. Maybe it was fate, but she understood instantly. She placed her small palms against the cold rock, her face scrunched in concentration. Soon after, her eyes flew open. She had felt it. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the hush guard marching in the courtyard. More importantly, I began to teach her the shadow step. As if pulled by a string, I moved to the darkest corner of the cell and let the ink swallow me. Moments later, I reappeared behind her, my breath hot against her neck. She didn't know what scared her more, the speed of my movement or the fact that she hadn't heard a single pebble crunch. Still, she didn't shrink away. Rather, she stood up and walked into the darkness herself. In the span of a breath, her form began to flicker like a dying candle. Because of that, I knew she was ready to see the truth of our prison. Chapter 8. The Ghosts in the Walls. That night, the silver dampeners in the walls hummed with a low, hateful energy. As a result, the guards were distracted, their heads ringing from the feedback of Caden's growing power. It was the perfect time. I pulled Elara close, wrapping my shadow aura around both of us until we were nothing but a smudge in the air. Without thinking, we slipped through the bars. The silver bit at my fur, but no matter how hard she tried, Elara didn't let out a sound. Between one breath and the next, we were in the corridor, moving like smoke against the rough stone walls. Eventually, we reached the ventilation shafts that looked down into the great hall. As the wind shifted, the scent of incense and burnt ozone hit me like a physical blow. What's worse was the sight below us. Hundreds of shifters stood in perfect, terrifying rows. Their eyes were vacant, their bodies swaying in a slow, sickening unison. Truth be told, they looked like puppets with their strings tangled. In that moment, I felt Elara's heart hammer against my ribs. She was seeing what Caden called unity, the total erasure of the individual soul. Deep down, she knew the truth, and so did I. Caden wasn't just an alpha. He was a black hole. In fact, I watched as he walked among the rows, his hand glowing with a sickly violet light. As the silence roared, he touched a young warrior's forehead. Just like that, the warrior's eyes turned gray, and a wisp of silver energy flowed from his temple into Caden's palm. Because of that, Caden's skin seemed to tighten and glow with stolen youth, which meant the ritual wasn't just about control. It was a harvest of the pack's very essence. Chapter 9. The Lunar Key. Before either could speak, Silas felt a surge of ancient, kingly rage. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara felt it too. The memories of Silas's father, the old alpha who had ruled with love instead of hunger. Suddenly, Caden stopped in the center of the hall. Under the weight of his stare, even the shadows seemed to tremble. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a heavy silver pendant, the Lunar Key. As the bond pulsed, my wolf let out a silent internal howl. That key was the source of the curse that kept me glitched in this broken body. Still, the key was more than just a curse. More importantly, it was the anchor for the singularity. As though fate whispered, I realized that if we could steal that key, the hive mind would shatter. But then, a guard turned toward our hiding spot, his nose twitching. Without warning, the sensory link between Elara and me tightened. She didn't wait for my signal. Her body moved on instinct, sending a wave of calm toward the guard's mind. As if fate demanded it, the guard blinked, looked away, and continued his patrol. In the quiet that followed, we retreated back into the darkness of the tunnels. As the sky darkened further, Silas looked at the small woman beside him. She was no longer just a ghost or a mute. She was the only person in the world who could move through Caden's mental minefield without setting off the alarms. As her soul answered my unspoken vow, I knew what we had to do. Wait, can a king and a girl with no voice really take down an army of 1,000 minds? And she let it happen, her hand finding mine in the dark as the first act of our silent war began. Chapter 10. The Parasite's Feast. The air in the obsidian keep didn't just feel heavy anymore. It felt like breathing through wet wool. Because of that, Silas and Elara moved through the upper rafters of the great hall like twin ghosts carved from the same darkness. What followed was a sight that made my wolf's hackles rise in a primal snarl. Caden stood on the obsidian dais, his fingers digging into the skull of an elderly pack member who had once been my father's most loyal advisor. Next, the room turned bone-chillingly cold. Truth be told, it wasn't the temperature dropping, but the soul-sucking vacuum of Caden's power. As the silence roared, a thin, silver thread of light pulsed between the elder's eyes and Caden's chest. In that moment, I felt Elara's grip on my arm tighten until her nails drew blood. She didn't know what scared her more, the elder's face shriveling like a dry leaf, or the ecstatic, terrifying glow in Caden's eyes. More importantly, the sensory link allowed us to feel what the pack couldn't. It wasn't a union of minds. In fact, it was a slaughterhouse. Caden was literally eating the memories, the love, and the life force of his people to keep his own hollow heart beating. What's worse, I saw the singularity blueprints etched into the stone pillars behind him. Maybe it was fate, but my hyper-observation picked up the fatal flaw. As a result, I realized Caden wasn't just an alpha anymore. He was a parasite that had grown too large for its host. Without warning, the elder collapsed, a mindless husk hitting the floor with a hollow thud, which meant the ritual was accelerating. Before the words left her lips, I felt Elara's resolve harden into a diamond. She wasn't just a prisoner. She was the only one who could see the rot at the center of the kingdom. Chapter 11. The Shadow's Revelation. That night, we retreated to the sanctuary of the lower tunnels to process the horror we had witnessed. As his scent in the air lingered, a mix of copper and ancient stone, I turned to Elara. Moments later, I used the sensory link to show her the midpoint of our plan. As the wind shifted, I projected a vision of her standing at the center of the ritual circle. Truth be told, her mute nature wasn't a defect. It was a biological dead zone. Because of that, She was the only one who could stand in the path of Caden's hunger without being consumed. Eventually, she understood. As her wolf stirred, she realized that if she could get close enough to the lunar key during the final ritual, she could act as a psychic ground wire. Still, the risk was absolute. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't hide the tremor in her hands. So I moved closer, my massive, clawed hand gently cupping her face. Between them, something cracked. The wall of my own self-loathing crumbled. In the span of a breath, I showed her that I didn't see a defective girl. I saw a queen who was stronger than any alpha I had ever known. By the time our foreheads touched, the air between us began to hum. As if fate demanded it, our scents merged, mountain rain and shadow musk. Her heart skipped, and just like that, the space between us burned with a heat that had nothing to do with the silver dampeners. Even so, the midpoint shift was clear. We couldn't just escape. Rather, we had to stay and dismantle Caden's godhood from the inside. As her soul answered, I felt the first real spark of hope I'd had in a decade. We weren't just two ghosts, we were the beginning of a revolution. Chapter 12, The Eye of the Storm. But then, the floor beneath us began to vibrate. Without thinking, I pushed Elara into a deep alcove and melded into the shadows over her. Soon after, the echo of Caden's mind swept through the tunnels like a searchlight. As the silence roared, I felt his mental fingers brushing against the edges of my consciousness. "I see you, little ghosts," Caden's voice whispered directly into our brains, cold as a winter grave. As if pulled by a string, a squad of hush guards rounded the corner, their eyes glowing with a dull, mindless gray. To make things worse, Caden appeared at the end of the hall, the lunar key glowing like a dying star against his chest. Under the weight of his stare, the very shadows seemed to bleed. Because of that, I knew our time for training was over. Time stood still as he looked directly at the spot where we were hidden. In fact, he couldn't see us, but he could feel the void we created in his perfect network. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, Elara realized that our secrecy was our only shield. Before either could speak, Caden let out a low, mocking laugh. "You think silence can hide you from the one who hears everything?" As the mark tingled, I realized he was testing the boundaries of the link. Without thinking, I sent a surge of feral animal static back at him, masking Elara's signature with my own monster fury. As a result, he recoiled, his face twisting in disgust, and just like that, everything changed. We weren't just fighting for our lives anymore, we were fighting for the very soul of the pack. Wait, how do you kill a god when you're just a monster and a girl with no voice? And she let it happen, her fingers interlacing with mine as we prepared to walk directly into the eye of the storm. Chapter 13, The Obsidian Gambit. The decision to stay was a death sentence, but leaving was a fate worse than the grave. Because of that, Silas and Elara moved through the artery-like tunnels of the keep with a lethal, unified purpose. What followed was the most dangerous stage of our plan, the infiltration of the Alpha's private sanctum. Next, I felt the silver dampeners in the walls screaming, their frequency rising as the singularity ritual neared its peak. Truth be told, my body was falling apart under the strain of holding the half-shift, yet the fire in Elara's eyes kept my heart beating. As her wolf stirred, Elara signaled for me to stop. In that moment, I felt her reach out through our link, her silence acting like a cloak that smothered the telepathic alarms of the guards ahead. She didn't know what scared her more, the thought of being caught or the absolute trust she was placing in my monster shadows. More importantly, the point of no return was staring us in the face, a heavy vault door made of pure reinforced silver. In fact, it was the heart of Caden's power, where the ritual's energy was channeled into the pack. What's worse, I saw the lunar key resting on a pedestal just inside the door, pulsing with a sick violet light. Maybe it was fate, but the door was guarded by the Hush Guard's captain, a man whose mind was nothing but a hollow shell of Caden's hatred. As a result, I realized that to get Elara inside, I would have to expose myself. Without warning, I pushed a vision of the future into her mind, a vision of her free and safe, which meant I was ready to die to make it real. Before the words left her lips, I saw her shake her head, her grip on my hand tightening until her knuckles turned white. Chapter 14. The Price of Humanity. That night, we made our move. As his scent in the air, the sharp smell of blood and old bone, filled the narrow corridor, I lunged from the shadows. Moments later, I was a blur of matted fur and lethal claws, slamming into the hush guard captain before he could even register my presence. As the silence roared, the silver of the vault door scorched my fur. But I didn't let go. Truth be told, the pain was a grounding wire, reminding me that I was still alive, still fighting for her. Because of that, Elara was able to slip past us, her form flickering like a ghost as she entered the sanctum. Eventually, she reached the pedestal. As if fate demanded it, she reached for the lunar key. Still, the moment her fingers brushed the silver, the entire keep groaned. No matter how hard she tried, the psychic weight of 1,000 enslaved souls began to pour into her void. So I fought harder, my claws tearing through the captain's armor as I felt Elara's agony through the link. Between them, something cracked. I had a choice. I could grab the lunar key myself and break my own curse, returning to my human form, or I could use my shadow aura to shield her from the psychic backlash. By the time I made my choice, the world felt like it was ending. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I didn't reach for the key. Instead, I threw my entire shadow form over her, acting as a living shield against Caden's parasitic hunger. Her heart skipped, and just like that, I felt my own life force being drained away. Even so, I didn't care. I saw her face, clear and beautiful in the dark, and I knew that her safety was the only cure I ever truly needed. As her soul answered, the vault door hissed shut, locking us inside the very heart of the enemy's power. Chapter 15. The Brother's Shadow. But then, the air in the sanctum turned to ice. Without thinking, I pulled Elara behind me, my golden eyes scanning the darkness. Soon after, Caden's laughter echoed from every corner of the room, a sound that felt like shards of glass in my brain. As the silence roared, he stepped out of the violet light, looking more like a demon than a man. "I knew you were alive, brother," he whispered, his eyes glowing with a terrifying, absolute dominance. As if pulled by a string, he raised his hand, and the lunar key flew from the pedestal into his palm. To make things worse, the mental scourge began. Under the weight of his stare, every shifter in the keep began to scream in unison, a telepathic wave of pain that hit me like a physical blow. Because of that, my half-shift began to fail, my bones grinding together as I fought to stay standing. Time stood still as Caden looked at Elara, a cruel smirk twisting his face. "You chose a mute girl over your own throne, Silas. How pathetic." In fact, he didn't realize that her silence was the only thing he couldn't control. Before either could speak, Caden lunged. As the mark tingled, I felt the link between Elara and me surge with a new, desperate energy. Without thinking, I sent every ounce of my remaining strength into her, a sacrificial blast of power that pushed her toward the exit. As a result, Caden's attention shifted, his eyes narrowing as he realized he had lost his perfect vessel. And just like that, everything changed. I was dragged down by silver nets, the metal burning into my throat as I watched Elara disappear into the shadows. Wait, can a monster truly save a queen by becoming a martyr? And she let it happen, her eyes locked onto mine one last time before the darkness of the keep swallowed us both. Chapter 16. The Hollow King hope is a dangerous thing in a place built on despair, and right now my hope is bleeding out on the cold stone floor. Because of that, I didn't even fight when the silver chains bit into my wrists, pinning my massive, broken frame to the center of the great hall. What followed was a nightmare made of iron and ego. Caden stood over me, his face a mask of triumphant cruelty as he watched my wolfskin smoke against the silver. Next, the room began to fill with the linked, hundreds of our packmates, their eyes dull and gray, moving like zombies to the rhythm of Caden's pulse. As the silence roared, I searched the shadows for any sign of a mountain air scent. At that moment, I felt a void in my chest where the sensory link used to be. She didn't know what scared her more, the pain of the chains or the absolute silence that followed her escape. More importantly, I was back to being a monster in a cage, watching the man who stole my life prepare to steal the souls of everyone I ever loved. In fact, Caden leaned down, his breath smelling of ozone and rot, and whispered, "She's gone, Silas. Your little ghost flickered out the moment you let go." What's worse, I believed him. Maybe it was fate, but my spirit finally snapped under the weight of 10 years of failure. As a result, I stopped trying to hold back the glitch. I let the wolf and the man collide in a mess of agony, hoping the pain would finally kill the part of me that still dared to love. Without warning, Caden signaled the guards to bring out the sacrifice, which meant my heart stopped beating before the door even opened. Before the words left her lips, or rather before the silence arrived, I saw the heavy glass tank being wheeled onto the dais. Chapter 17. The Sensory Tomb. That night, the great hall became a cathedral of madness. As his scent in the air, the smell of a predator who had already won, filled the room, Caden motioned toward the tank. Moments later, I saw her. Elara wasn't dead, but she looked like a broken doll as they lowered her into the sensory deprivation fluid. As the silence roared, I realized this was her dark night of the soul. Caden wasn't killing her. He was erasing her. By stripping away every sense, touch, sight, sound, he was making her the perfect, empty vessel for his parasitic hive mind. Eventually, the lid closed, and the violet light of the lunar key began to bleed into the water. As if fate demanded it, I let out a howl that wasn't human or wolf, but a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. Still, no one moved. The pack stood frozen, their minds already half-digested by Caden's hunger. No matter how hard she tried, Elara was drifting away into a void where I couldn't reach her. So, I fought the silver one last time, my muscles tearing, my blood sizzling against the floor. Between them, something cracked. It wasn't the chains. It was my will to live. By the time the ritual hit its crescendo, the air in the keep was screaming with telepathic feedback. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I saw Elara's eyes through the glass. They were wide, vacant, and turning the same horrific gray as the others. Her heart skipped, and just like that, I felt the last thread of our link snap. I was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Even so, Caden wasn't finished. He wanted me to watch as he took the one thing that had made me feel like a man again. As her soul answered the darkness, I felt my own mind start to slip into the feral black. Chapter 18. The Rhythm in the Bone. But then, the world went quiet. Not the peaceful quiet of a forest, but the terrifying silence of the grave. Without thinking, I closed my eyes and waited for the end. Soon after, a sensation started in the soles of my feet, a tiny rhythmic vibration. As the silence roared, I realized it wasn't coming from the guards or the ritual. It was coming from the floorboards. Tap, 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 tap. As if pulled by a string, my wolf's ears twitched. It was the code. The simple, rhythmic code Elara had used in the cells to tell me she was listening. To make things worse for Caden, he was too busy drinking the pack's power to notice the dead zone widening at the center of the room. Under the weight of his stare, Elara's body in the tank looked lifeless, but her spirit was doing exactly what I had taught her. She was hiding in the shadows of her own mind. Because of that, I felt a spark of white-hot lightning hit my heart. She wasn't gone. She was waiting for me to wake up. Time stood still as I looked at the silver chains, no longer seeing them as a cage, but as a challenge. Before either could speak, I felt a surge of the unspoken power. As the mark tingled, I realized that if she could fight from inside a coffin, I could fight from inside these chains. Without thinking, I stopped fighting the silver and started absorbing it, using the pain to fuel a final, desperate shift. As a result, the metal began to glow red-hot against my skin. and just like that, everything changed. I wasn't a monster, and I wasn't a man. I was the Alpha. Wait, can a broken king find the strength to shatter a god when his own bones are turning to ash? And she let it happen, her tapping growing louder in my mind, as I prepared for the final push that would either save my people or destroy us all. Chapter 19. The Shattered Crown. Despair is a liar, but the rhythm of the stone never lies. Because of that, I stopped fighting the silver chains and started listening to the vibration beneath my paws. Tap, 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 tap. What followed was a surge of adrenaline so potent it tasted like lightning on my tongue. Elara was reaching out from the sensory tomb, her silence acting as a beacon in the storm of Caden's mental static. Next, I felt the silver dampeners in my wrists begin to groan. Truth be told, the metal wasn't breaking because of my strength. It was melting because my internal temperature had reached the boiling point of a true alpha. As her wolf stirred, I looked up at the dais. Caden was lost in his own god complex, his eyes rolled back as he drained the life force of the kneeling pack. At that moment, I saw a shadow move near the back of the hall. She didn't know what scared her more, seeing me pinned like a butterfly or realizing she had an ally. More importantly, it was Merrick, my old beta, his eyes flickering between gray and gold. In fact, he had been faking his submission, waiting for a spark. Maybe it was fate, but I gave him the only signal I could, a low, guttural vibration that shook the floorboards. Soon after, Merrick moved. Without warning, he drew a jagged blade and severed the power line to the silver dampeners. As a result, the agonizing buzz in my head vanished, which meant the monster was finally off the leash. Before the words left her lips, or rather, before the tank could drown her, I let out a roar that shattered every stained glass window in the great hall. In the span of a breath, the silver chains snapped like dry twigs. I stood up, 7 feet of smoke and fury, my golden eyes locked onto my brother's throat. Chapter 20. The Army of Ghosts. That night, the broken finally found their voice. As his scent in the air, the stench of scorched silver and ancient power, wafted through the hall, I didn't rush the dais. Moments later, I turned to the rows of unlinked shifters, the elderly, the maimed, and the ghosts Caden had deemed useless. As the silence roared, I didn't use a telepathic command. Instead, I used the sensory link to broadcast a single pulsing image, Elara's face. Truth be told, it was the first time they had felt a pure emotion in years. Because of that, the gray in their eyes began to bleed back into gold. Eventually, a wall of silent warriors formed behind me. As if fate demanded it, we didn't need words to coordinate. Still, the Hushguard realized the shift too late. No matter how hard she tried, Elara's presence in the tank was acting as a psychic black hole, sucking away the energy Caden needed to control his soldiers. So we moved. Between them, something cracked. It was the absolute authority of the Obsidian Pack. We hit the Hushguard like a tidal wave of shadow, our movements perfectly synced because we were feeling each other's heartbeats through the floor. By the time we reached the foot of the dais, the air was thick with the sounds of a physical war. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I saw the tank begin to crack from the pressure of the magic inside. Her heart skipped, and just like that, I realized Caden was trying to detonate the vessel to kill us all. Even so, I wouldn't let her go. I threw my body against the glass, my shoulder taking the brunt of the impact. As her soul answered, the glass shattered, and a flood of violet-tinted water spilled across the obsidian floor, carrying Elara into my arms. Chapter 21. The Silent Oracle's Ascent. But then, the ground lurched. Without thinking, I pulled Elara's shivering body against my chest, shielding her from the shards of glass. Soon after, Caden let out a scream of pure, ego-driven madness. As the silence roared, he held the lunar key high, trying to force the singularity back into existence. As if pulled by a string, every shifter in the room fell to their knees, their hands clutching their heads. To make things worse, the violet light from the key began to turn a sickly, necrotic black. Under the weight of his stare, I felt my own mind start to fray. Because of that, I looked down at Elara. She was gasping for air, her skin pale, but her eyes were the clearest things in the room. Time stood still as she reached up and touched my jaw. In fact, she didn't need to speak. She pointed at the lunar key, then at her own chest. As the mark tingled, I realized what she was asking. She wanted to be the ground wire for the entire Pax Pain. Before either could speak, I felt the weight of her sacrifice. As a result, I didn't argue. I stood up, lifting her high so she could see the monster on the throne. As if fate demanded it, I let out a final, bone-shaking howl that signaled the start of the end. Without thinking, I began the final charge toward my brother, with the girl who had no voice acting as my shield against the god who had no heart. As her wolf stirred, the sensory link expanded until it covered the entire hall, turning our silence into a weapon that could level mountains. Wait, can a broken king and a mute girl really survive the explosion of 1,000 souls? And she let it happen, her fingers tightening around my neck as we stepped into the blinding light of the final confrontation. Chapter 22. The Shattering of the Singularity. The air didn't just vibrate, it tore. Because of that, Silas and Caden collided in the center of the dais like two dying stars fighting for the same patch of sky. What followed was a physical manifestation of a decade's worth of hatred and stolen power. Caden's claws were wreathed in violet necrotic flames, but next, I felt Elara's presence behind me, her hands pressed firmly against the small of my back. Truth be told, every time Caden's mental echo tried to liquefy my brain, the energy simply vanished. It hit Elara and was grounded into the earth, leaving me free to be the monster Caden had created. As her wolf stirred, I caught Caden's wrist, the silver of the lunar key burning a hole through my palm. In that moment, I didn't feel pain. I felt the absolute shivering terror of my brother. She didn't know what scared her more, the way Caden's face began to peel back like wet paper or the raw primal power radiating from my skin. More importantly, the sensory link was no longer a secret between two people. In fact, it had expanded into a massive, silent network that connected every broken shifter in the hall. Maybe it was fate, but as Caden tried to command the pack to kill me, the only thing they felt was Elara's bone-deep compassion. Soon after, the violet light of the singularity began to flicker and die. Without warning, I drove my knee into Caden's chest, the sound of his ribs snapping echoing like gunshots through the sudden silence. As a result, the lunar key was jarred loose, hanging by a single silver thread around his neck, which meant the god was finally bleeding. Before the words left her lips, Elara lunged forward, her fingers catching the silver chain. In the span of a breath, the entire history of our pack's suffering flowed through her. As the silence roared, she didn't scream. She simply pulled. Chapter 23. The Return of the King. That night, the sky above the obsidian keep finally cleared, revealing a moon that bled silver over the carnage. As his scent in the air, the smell of ozone and a dying parasite, faded, Caden collapsed to his knees. Moments later, I snapped the silver chain of the lunar key and pressed the artifact against Caden's own forehead. As the silence roared, I didn't kill him with claws. I killed him with the link. I forced the collective grief of every soul he had eaten back into his hollow mind. Truth be told, his brain couldn't hold that much humanity. Because of that, his eyes turned a flat, glassy gray before he slumped forward, a shell of a man who had forgotten how to breathe. Eventually, a heavy, holy silence settled over the hall. As if fate demanded it, my body began to change. Still, this wasn't the agonizing glitch of the last 10 years. No matter how hard she tried, Elara couldn't keep the tears from falling as she watched my matted fur recede and my bones knit back into a human shape. So I stood before my people, naked, scarred, but finally whole. Between them, something cracked. It was the old world of mental subjugation. By the time I reached for Elara, the broken were standing, their heads bowed not in fear, but in a reverence that didn't need a telepathic shout to be felt. By the time the sun began to peek over the mountain ridges, the obsidian keep had a new heartbeat. As fire bloomed beneath her skin, I lifted Elara's hand and pressed it to my heart. Her heart skipped, and just like that, the pack felt it, a pulse of pure, wordless love that acted as the new foundation of our law. Even so, I refused the Alpha's dominance link. Rather, I offered them a choice, to be free or to be family. As her soul answered, every shifter in the room reached out to touch the person next to them, creating a chain of physical empathy that Caden could never have imagined. Chapter 24. The Haven of Echoes. But then, the reality of our new life began to set in. Without thinking, I led Elara out onto the high balcony overlooking the valley. Soon after, the Hush Guards surrendered their weapons, their minds finally clearing from the gray fog. As the silence roared, I realized that being a king wasn't about the noise of 1,000 minds. It was about the quiet of a single heart. As if pulled by a string, Elara stepped up beside me, her eyes reflecting the gold of the new dawn. To make things worse for the tyrants of the other packs, they now had a dead zone they could never conquer. Because of that, we spent the next few months turning the keep into a sanctuary. Under the weight of his stare, every shifter who had been discarded for being defective found a home within our walls. Time stood still as I watched Elara teach the young pups how to listen to the wind without the noise of the link. In fact, she had become the silent oracle, the soul of the Haven of Echoes. As the mark tingled, I realized that our bond was the only thing that had ever been real. Before either could speak, Silas pulled Elara into his arms, savoring the solid, real presence of the woman who had saved him. As her soul answered, I looked out at the forest and felt a peace I hadn't known since I was a child. As a result, the core emotional question was finally answered. A monster is only a monster until someone dares to hear his silence. And she let it happen, her head resting against my chest as we watched the first snow of winter fall over a kingdom that was finally, beautifully quiet. Epilogue. The quietest heart. That night, a year after the fall of Caden, a fire crackled in the hearth of our private quarters. Come morning, the world would be busy with the politics of the council. But for now, there was only us. As the wind shifted, I knelt beside Elara, my hand resting on the gentle curve of her stomach. Suddenly, I felt a tiny rhythmic kick against my palm. As the silence roared, I closed my eyes and leaned my forehead against hers. I didn't need to ask if she was happy. I could feel the gold leaf warmth of her joy through our skin. Deep down, she knew the truth, and she wanted me to feel it too. Our child would be born into a world where their voice didn't define their value. As if fate whispered, I realized that the baby's heartbeat was perfectly in sync with ours. A steady, quiet rhythm that was louder than any alpha's command. Without thinking, I kissed Elara's forehead, the scent of mountain rain still lingering in her hair, which meant that even though she never spoke a word, she had given me the greatest conversation of my life. And she let it happen, her fingers interlacing with mine as we drifted into a dreamless, peaceful sleep, knowing that the shadows were no longer a place to hide, but a place to call home. The end.